This is the season in which CBST celebrates 10 years in this beautiful sanctuary on 30th Street. We celebrated this through music at our Shabbat Shirah concert a few weeks ago. Our president reflected on this just 2 weeks ago on the Shabbat marking our anniversary, reflecting on our history, our 53rd birthday, if you will. And in just a few weeks, in April, we will literally be 10 years since moving into this space, the dedication of this sanctuary. It's a beautiful thing to be reading these last 5 Parshiot in Exodus in the middle of this season, because we often take inspiration from our ancestors on how they were told to build a Mishkan, the portable dwelling place of God that would travel with the Israelites through the wilderness. This week's Parshat, Tetzaveh, zooms in with instructions on the oil for the Ner Tamid, and then focuses on the priests who will lead ritual life in the Mishkan. Details of their clothing, the mineralogy, it seems, of every jewel, every drop of blood that will be offered on the altar is imagined to be sprinkled in this future sanctuary, replete with meaning after meaning after meaning. So unless you're a first-timer to CBST, and maybe even if you are, you've probably heard something about how thoughtfully, planfully, and tirelessly this community worked to get to here and now. The here and the now over time of 53 years of history, and the here and the now of being right here in this space, in this Mishkan, for almost 10 years. Like the framework of these Parshiot, many of our forebears and many of our contemporaries in this community had a vision that may not have been so different than what the Torah describes. There was thoughtful planning. There was community engagement. They put experts in charge. They took careful measurements. And then people stepped up and gave voluntarily. So many members and friends of CBST who gave gifts to make sure that CBST had a home of its own are memorialized on the list of people you see on the way into the lobby. Memorialized meaning they're still alive, most of them, but thought of, if you will. On the list of people you see on the way into the lobby from the street, and also on the way from the wine sanctuary down to the Wolfson gathering space on the lower level. Last week in Torah time, Hashem told Moshe to have the Israelites bring gifts, build the sanctuary, and God would dwell among us. The cluster of these Parshiot from last week to this to next builds from the structure of the ark to the details of the whole Mishkan compound, to the clothing the priests will wear, and eventually describes how the priests will be formally anointed. And finally, as we move into next week's parashah, there is a census of the entire people. Perhaps the level of detail in the commandments for how to build the Mishkan is hinting at something so precious. Every single person counts. Even though we start with the things, and even though we get into the clothing for the leaders and how they get anointed, ultimately we count person by person, 1/2 shekel at a time, a beautiful, beautiful compliment to the anointing of priests. On the one hand, there is structure, responsibility, accountability of the community's representatives. But lest we get concerned, anyone fall back into where we came from in the hierarchy turned tyranny of ancient Egypt, we are reminded right away that even Aaron the high priest and his sons are there to serve, and that every service is supported by the people who are counted 1/2 shekel by 1/2 shekel by 1/2 shekel, one by one by one. I know that the announcement about CBST and me parting ways last week has aroused a plethora of emotions, inspired questions about how we arrived here, and raised concerns about what the future has in store for the Kahal. What questions are presented to us? What lessons can we learn from these 5 parshiot that take us from standing at Sinai to the end of the book of Exodus that might help us as a community, you as a community, meet this moment? I want to highlight 2. Which comes first? A sense of connectedness, shared purpose, and community, which facilitates the building of a Mishkan? Or is it the building of a sacred space that comes first? And by doing that, we amplify the relationships that start to exist among people, but really result in a sense of greater purpose. Building a sanctuary is an incredible project. There are people in this room, you're one of them, who can attest to that, right? Wow, there's material aspect, identifying space, permits, architecture, to gathering money, materials, contractors, vendors, acousticians, and the spiritual aspect. What does it mean to say, V'shachanti bitocham? God will dwell here. How do we lead with our values and greatest hopes and dreams, some of which were literally written by members of this community, handwriting that remains embedded in these walls with those hopes and dreams on them? What does it take to build a physical manifestation of a spiritual home? What systems are in place to make sure that this feels like a home that is always hospitable to Shekhinah, to God's imminent presence dwelling among us? Sometimes people shudder when the synagogue or other Jewish community organizational leaders remind them that, in this case, a synagogue, though a spiritual entity, is also a business. Uh-oh, he said the word business. No, it's not a generating revenue for its shareholders kind of business. And yes, in this business, some employees report to other employees, and the board oversees the lead staff, and yet ultimately, each of us, right, whether we work here, whether we're a member here, whether we're a board member here, each of us, every single one of us, is a servant to the mission of the congregation. That is ultimately who we report to right here at CBST. From a spiritual perspective, of course, we're all accountable to God, however you might imagine God. But in the day-to-day, in the fixing of leaks, the security systems, the photocopying, and the classes we teach, the words that we use with each other in passing, and the words that are said on the bima in teaching or prayer, we are accountable to our mission to be a spiritual home for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, to be passionate, provocative, and deeply Jewish, a community that engages in spirited debate and activism, rejoices in diversity, denounces social justice wherever it exists, and strives for civil rights for all people. Striving to be the kind of spiritual home that we've tried to be from the very beginning inspires that sense of belonging, excitement, intrigue, and Torah, of debate and activism. And, from the other angle, all that learning and activism, the diversity of this community and our commitment to hold in the center of our community and raise up people who might be the most vulnerable, that can remind us over and over again about why we have been here for 53 years and why we are still here. Second question. We're all still standing at Mount Sinai in this week's Torah portion, right? Of course, right. How long will we stay there? The answer to this, as the kids say, is it's complicated. Certainly the story is that we are at Sinai for the revelation of the Decalogue, the so-called Ten Commandments, maybe a bit mistranslated. But as we start to understand the mitzvot, the instructions on how we are to live a life of fullness and interconnectedness, keep coming and coming. They are so many that Moshe is on the top of the mountain for 40 days. The people below are starting to get distracted, seem to need something else. That's next week's Parshat. We don't have to get too into it. But we are at Mount Sinai for the rest of Sefer Shemot. We're at Mount Sinai for the rest of Exodus. And not just that. It goes on. Even in the very last pasuk of Leviticus, the third book of the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, the last pasuk is Elah hamitzvot asher tziva Adonai et Moshe el bnei Yisrael behar Sinai. These are the mitzvot that the Holy One commanded to Moshe for the Israelites at Mount Sinai. So the Torah starts to set us up for revelation that is not simply Anochi Adonai Elohecha, but rather not just those 10 statements carved on mysterious stone tablets that are broken and then restored, but for some kind of ongoing revelation that goes on throughout the rest of the second book of Torah, certainly through the third. And we have a tradition that elaborates on this, that not only was the written Torah given to us at Mount Sinai, but that the oral law was given at Mount Sinai as well. Even though the Talmud won't be written down in the form we have it for some 2,000 more years in our amazing mythic history, so we might wander away from the physical mountain for nearly 40 years in the desert, and then another 3,500, give or take, to get us to today. But ideally, the mountain has never wandered away from us. We say that every Jewish person, past, present, and future, was there at Mount Sinai. But what if we understood that Mount Sinai was in each of us as well? After all, what is oral tradition, oral law, if not the actual storytelling, spirited debate, real lived experience of each and every human being? Each of us embossed from the divine image in every generation. So yes, community coming together is what can build, develop, and strengthen a sacred space. And engaging in a project with a shared goal is what can develop the connections that make community. And ideally, each of these two things is feeding off of one another, getting stronger and stronger all the time. Each member of this kahal gets to decide what that means for them. Showing up to meetings, asking good questions, amplifying solid ideas, arguing for the sake of heaven. How long were we at Sinai? Some ways that the Torah is told, right? That sense of reverence, that synesthesia, were one-time moments in our sacred story. But perhaps, as the mystical tradition suggests, 22 letters of the words of the Torah, together with 10 numerals, 10 sfirot, were themselves the building blocks of everything there is. So sidebar, my new favorite dad joke. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. But Torah is at once a gift given to humanity week by week, generation after generation, and Torah is the blueprint of the entire universe. We are a tradition that often loves unresolved questions, questions with multiple answers, a tradition that sometimes frames things in binary terms only to find so much fluidity, nonconformity, liminal time and space in between. On this Shabbat of Parshat, Tetzaveh, Shabbat Zachor, the Kahal, our congregation, may be in space more liminal than anyone expected we'd be at this moment. 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago. But as Sefer HaYetzirah teaches, the universe was created with 22 letters and 10 numerals. The building blocks are sometimes much more evident than we even realize when we allow ourselves to see them. Sometimes we overcomplicate things, and we need to not overcomplicate things. Sometimes we focus on the things that we want rather than the things that we really need. Sometimes we prioritize things that feel urgent rather than things that are actually important. And when we continue to flip some of that around, to ask good questions, to engage with people who are thoughtful experts, and to hold each other accountable, we can constantly work toward that mission. I'm going to say it again. To be a spiritual home for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. To be passionate, provocative, and deeply Jewish. A community that engages in spirited debate and activism. Rejoices in diversity, denounces social injustice wherever it exists, and strives for civil rights for all people. I hope that with Purim around the corner, I barely have to remind this community that even at a time that might feel very serious for us, there is still great value, not only in the kind of play that is in Broadway houses and Purim spiels in off-Broadway houses of 299, but that playing well in the sandbox, being playful with one another, and being willing to love, learn, and lead with humor, to laugh at ourselves and with each other, is not only a form of spiritual resistance, but as I mentioned earlier, right, Glow, Atanmo teaches, micro joys are how we survive macro grief. And what goes for Purim, what's good enough for Purim, is good enough for Tisha B'Av as well. So the Talmud teaches, Misha nichnas Adar marbin b'simcha, as the month of Adar enters, we increase in joy, we increase in happiness. My wish for this community, for all of us, is that the days ahead bring more happiness for each of us, for this sacred community, for the Jewish people, and for all who dwell on earth. Shabbat Shalom.